Well, each year the Drug Detection Agency conducts 200,000 random drug tests for businesses in New Zealand, of which they find traces of drugs in 5% of those tests. Now, of that 5%, 70% is cannabis, but a number have traces of multiple drugs in their system as well. So should employers in the primary sector fear the impending regulation changes to recreational use of cannabis here in New Zealand at the referendum at next month's election? Glenn Dobson has been a senior sergeant in the New Zealand Police, specialising in drugs, worked as a safety manager for the Christchurch City Council, led the team of the National Manager of Coroner's Office, and this is all before he joined the Drug Detection Agency, now as Chief Operating Officer. Glenn joins us now. Welcome to Sarah's Country, Glenn.
Good to be here. Thanks very much.
Firstly, excuse me, how do you work with employers to actually see out and conduct these drug tests?
Yeah, look, I guess one of the first questions we'll always ask an employer when we speak to them is what are they trying to achieve? It's incredibly important that the drug testing program that employers put in their workplace works for them. Every workplace is different and it has to fit within their culture. So it's important from the Drug Detection Agency's perspective that we understand what they're trying to achieve and then fit a program or a regime that works for their unique workplace and for their people. It's incredibly important that everyone is well informed, that it's open and honest, and there are good conversations around it, and it's based on a solid policy document that really sets out the expectations of both the employer and the employees.
It must be a real balance because, of course, in a great culture in a workplace is trust, but there's at the same time balancing that communication with we're trying to keep everybody safe.
Yeah, look, it is a balance, and it's sometimes a tightrope that employers have to walk. Employers have got a huge amount of responsibility on them, and one of those ones that TDA deal with and work with employers is around the Health and Safety at Work Act. And that says that every employer has to manage risks within the workplace, and it actually lists drugs and alcohol as a recognised risk in the workplace. So they've got a fiduciary duty to make sure they manage those risks properly, and that's through various ways, including drug and alcohol policy, education, testing, the whole lot.
Okay, so how impaired in your experience, and of course you're a senior sergeant in that introduction, is workers under the influence of cannabis in the workplace, and more so than, let's say, being hungover at work?
Yeah, look, this impairment question is quite a tricky one. With workplace drug testing, we'll carry out a number of different, I guess, drug tests, whether it's urine test and oral fluid test. We also do hair sampling to see drug presence within the person's hair as well. And each of those will sit in a different reason and sit within a different rationale. But one thing toxicology doesn't measure is it doesn't measure impairment. And it's a difficult conversation. It's a terminology that we need to get away from a little bit. It's actually managing for employers the risk of impairment. And if drugs are present in the workplace, then there's a risk that impairment is there. And certainly in safety sensitive roles, if you're talking about farming in the country and so forth, you've got a lot of heavy machinery. You've got a lot of workers that may be remote and away from help and so forth. And if their judgment or if their physical abilities are affected by drugs, then there's a risk that will create a hazard on their workplace.
I do really want to come back to this culture around it, and I'm just taking it from, say, for instance, an employer's perspective, and they're listening and watching to this, and they go, we'd just like to be able to bring it in a way that we don't feel like we're targeting anyone specifically, that it's just something we randomly do just to keep everybody safe. How would you suggest that employers can bring up that conversation and build it into just a policy of work?
Look, quite often what we encourage workplaces to do, and a lot of workplaces do have, are like toolbox sessions. In the mornings before the start of shift, they may be talking about something new that's in the workplace. They may be talking about some new policies or processes they're doing, but also they may be talking about health and safety. And as you described it there, is a really good way for an employer just to bring it up. Hey, look, your guys' safety is incredibly important to me. I not only have a responsibility under legislation to manage your safety, but actually I really care about you guys. And I want to make sure that you guys get home to your families, to your loved ones, to your kids at the end of the day. And I'm sure you feel the same for your colleagues as well. And one of the risks that I really want to talk about is drugs in the workplace. I have to manage it. enough to make sure you guys are safe, and here's some ways that we can manage that, and start discussing that and have a conversation around the reasons why and so forth.
Absolutely. Now let's talk and move now to this referendum. There's a BERL report that's calculated that if it's come in, 420 cannabis outlets will be established, greater than KFC, McDonald's and Burger King combined. So making this readily available, what is your greatest concern in all your experience, both in the police force and now at the Drug Detection Agency, that these legislation changes to cannabis will make it very hard? Will it change the culture around this workplace environment?
Yeah, look, I think so. Look, one of the really interesting parts of that BERL report around the cannabis outlets is, number one, that's the number that they found would be financially viable. Like any business, there may be more numbers, but that's the number they came around that would be financially viable. But not only that, I guess for your audience, 117 of those 420 are in rural townships. So that's a lot in the rural townships themselves. So, it's a target audience for them. Look, the concerns from the Drug Detection Agency is really around if cannabis becomes legalised, access will be increased. More increased access for people to cannabis will increase cannabis effects in the workplace, will increase the risks of the dangers of the drugs, and also the risks that workers will bring to their own colleagues and so forth. That's our biggest concern.
But at the same time, there has been reports that contradict that as well. And with legalisation, potentially there'll be more testing, and so therefore the levels of THC could be managed in terms of the strength.
Yeah, look, all you got to do is look at some of the overseas examples. I mean, let's look at a bit of history and learn from other countries' mistakes, I guess, or learn from their experiences, I should say. It's no secret that the USA, a number of states in the USA, have gone through a lot of legalisation around the states. And of all those states that have gone through legalisation of cannabis, all of them have seen an increase in the THC that's been found in the workplace when they've been doing drug testing. That then means that there's more cannabis in the workplace. That increases the risk. If I was an employer, I'd be incredibly concerned about that.
It said there 70% of the drug traces that you've found are cannabis. I want to talk about that other 30% because I do worry about hard drugs in rural New Zealand and employers being able to keep their families, their communities and their staff safe from this. And it certainly could be on the rise in certain areas as well. I mean, what's your fear, and what are some of those biggest drugs that are really affecting our country?
Look, it's no secret that cannabis is probably the most commonly available drug in New Zealand. And of our positive tests, cannabis does show up roughly about 70% of the time. But often we'll see our positive drug results have multiple drugs in there, what's known as polydrug use, multiple drugs. The second most common drug, again, is no secret, it's in the media all the time, it's methamphetamine. Methamphetamine is a scourge in society, as is any drug abuse. And behind that, we're starting to see some real issues around prescription drug abuse. Drugs, funny enough, are like any sort of consumable out there. They go through trends. And some of those trends are around the use of drugs. What we're starting to see at lower numbers, but certainly seen, is an increase in cocaine that's available out there at the moment. Recently, we've seen a few hits or a few positive test results around synthetic cannabis, AB Fubinaca, recently. Now, that's the same synthetic cannabis that was in the media a couple of years ago that's caused over 60 deaths and is in front of the coroner's court at the moment. So we see some trends, we see some drugs come and go, but certainly the main baseline certainly is cannabis and methamphetamine.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Glenn is from the Drug Detection Agency. This is Sarah's Country.